On this episode, we talk with Columbia University professor, founder and CTO of Allure Security, author of over 300 academic papers, and holder of 90 patents, Salvatore Stolfo. Join us as we see how artificial intelligence and machine learning can help our deception strategy on Take Back the Advantage. So welcome to Take Back the Advantage. My name is Kevin Fiskus. Deception has been around for a long time, and I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about some deception, in this case, that didn't work all that well. And this is actually a fairly famous or failure, if you will, of what could have been deception, and it's the Bay of Pigs, the incident during the early part of the Kennedy administration where the U.S. CIA was attempting to depose Fidel Castro in Cuba. And so the CIA came up with this plan to basically infiltrate Cuba with a guerrilla force and hopefully cause an uprising of the Cuban people. At least that was the initial plan. Well, as the planning went on, this invasion or this attempt to depose Fidel Castro actually crossed administrations. So the Kennedy administration was the one sort of credited with this, but they were sort of caught in this as Kennedy came into office. Now, what had happened was the U.S. had done something similar a number of years before in Guatemala. And so they're like, yeah, we did this before. We'll do it again. We're going to go get some exiled Cubans. We're going to train them. We're going to turn them into a guerrilla force. Now, they tried to do a few things deceptively. One of the things is they gave each of the guerrilla force members an identification number, but they started those numbers at 2,500 instead of 1 to try to artificially inflate the size of the force. They set up training camps in Florida and in Guatemala. Kennedy publicly stated that the U.S. military would not be invading Cuba, which was a little bit of a play with words because the U.S. military was never intending to do that. It was supposed to be these guerrilla forces. They tried some other deception stuff. They had a 168-man diversionary landing party for this invasion that was supposed to land in a different location. They also had rubber rafts that were equipped with effectively electronics gear to create sound effects of battle. That one actually worked pretty well. In an attempt to gain control of the air, they also did an airstrike against a Cuban airfield 2 days before the actual invasion. And to cover their tracks there, they actually had one of the pilots in that land back in Florida, but the plane was painted as if it was a defector from the Cuban Air Force. So they tried to play it off that a defector from the Cuban Air Force was involved in or responsible for the attack. Now, the problem is just about none of this worked all that well. There were significant leaks. Both U.S. press and foreign press had a lot of information about this well in advance, and any efforts to try to squash that were not really effective. The KGB, as well as Cuban intelligence G2, they had a lot of information as what's going on. Kennedy's statement was so parsed in terms of the wording that really nobody believed that. That 168-man landing completely failed. They tried twice to land and were unable to do so. There were miscommunications between the White House and the CIA. There was an underappreciation on the part of the CIA for the popular support of Castro in Cuba. The weird thing was the actual amphibious landing was largely a success. There were very few people that were killed in that landing, but they didn't anticipate because basically Castro had a lot of time to prepare for this. They ended up hitting resistance, and after about 2 days, the entire invasion had stalled. Now, there's not a lot of true deception in there, but there's a lot we can learn about deception as we talk about that. So one of the things that I've brought up a few times on this channel is that in the 1980s, the CIA developed what they call the 10 maxims of deception. And I wanted to look at a couple of those that failed or that worked against this particular Bay of Pig invasion. One is it's generally easier to induce an opponent to maintain a pre-existing belief than to present notional evidence to change that belief. In other words, once people have a belief, it's hard to get them to change their mind. And in this case, the CIA had at least some level of belief that there would be more of a popular uprising against Castro. And all of the evidence that was counter to that, they basically ignored. We tend to get focused on that. So there's sort of a failing of not taking into consideration that maxim. Another maxim that was published out there is surprise can be achieved in many forms. In military engagements, these forms include location, strength, intention, style, and timing. So effectively, there's all kinds of stuff we could do to accomplish surprise. And while in the Bay of Pigs invasion, they attempted to do that a little bit, they didn't really succeed in most cases. Also, deception becomes more difficult as the number of channels of information available to the victim increases. Effectively, Castro had all these channels of information that were available. He had news reports from U.S. news sources. He had news reports from foreign news sources. He had KGB intel. He had his own G2 intel. And all this stuff basically made it so it was a foregone conclusion as to what was going to happen. There was no surprise that was actually happening as part of that. Another piece of it is we talk about where possible, the objective of deception planner should be to reduce ambiguity in the mind of the victim, to force him to seize upon a notional worldview as to being correct. Or contrast to that, there may be cases where we want to increase ambiguity. And in the case of the Bay of Pigs, Castro was pretty sure what was going to happen, and he had a lot of information as to how and where and when and all that, and nothing was really done to increase his ambiguity, so he was ready. Similarly, deception activity should be sequenced to maximize the presence of the incorrect hypotheses for as long as possible. Well, unfortunately, there was very little of that was done, so Castro was ready. And then lastly, if you're going to do deception, the last maxim that I want to talk about is a scheme to ensure accurate feedback increases the chances of the deception. If you're trying to convince somebody a story, you need to get some feedback in terms of whether they're actually believing the story, and that also wasn't done. So we can see that there were a lot of failures that ultimately resulted in the entire amphibious landing of of the invasion force just completely stalling. And it's one of those large failures, those blots on American foreign policy, because it was such a disaster. There were so many miscommunications and things like that. But we can take lessons from that and apply those to the world of cyber, where we need to understand that we have to have a consistent picture, that we need to understand the behavior of our adversaries. We need to collect feedback and those types of things. So I thought that was an interesting story. Even though it's not one where deception was effectively used, it shows us what can happen when it's not being used. So that brings us up to our interview today. So we are going to be interviewing Salvatore Stolfo. He is a professor at Columbia University, a professor of computer science, specializing in computer security, IDS, and data mining-based security analytics. He's published over 300 papers, has 90 patents. He's got a Wikipedia page dedicated to them, which I think is a great measurement there. And if you look at that, all kinds of stuff on there about machine learning and AI and security and all that. He's got a bachelor's of science in computational mathematics and computer science from CUNY, the City University of New York, Brooklyn College. He's got a PhD in computer science from NYU. He's been he's an IEEE fellow. He's also ACM, the Association for Computing Machinery fellow. He's also a prolific entrepreneur as well, has been involved in the startups of multiple organizations, System Detection, which was ultimately acquired by Raytheon, Electronic Digital Documents, ultimately acquired by IBM. He's the founder of Red Balloon Security, as well as the CTO, founder and CTO, current CTO of Allure Security, where they focus on cyber deception. A couple other things. He also coined the term FOG, F-O-G computing, basically where technology is used to launch disinformation attacks against malicious insiders, presenting them from distinguishing real sensitive customer data from fake worthless data. So a lot of deception there. And I like this one as well. On his website, he has himself a computer scientist, old school professor, and entrepreneur motivated to create new solutions and technologies that have large impact beyond the insular ivy-clad towers of academia. So make things that are real. So as you can tell, I'm talking to a very, very smart person. Sal, anything you want to add?
Thank you, but I don't think so. I'm blushing. Let me just get my face back in normal mode. Thank you.
I actually have to admit that I have a little bit of fun going and scouring the internet for all of the accomplishments of people, because every single person that I've interviewed, I mean, the people so far that I've interviewed tend to be pretty humble people. And when you spit out all this stuff, then they're like, okay, that's enough of that. We can go on talking about something else.
That's true. I was hoping you were going to mention my dad's jokes on my website, but never mind.
Yeah, exactly. So, again, as we talk about, you've been involved in deception for quite some time. How'd you get interested in it, and what was sort of your introduction into the world of deception, and specifically perhaps cyber deception?
So just you mentioned earlier, by the way, that one of the earlier examples of deception is the Bay of Pigs, but obviously deception, I think the first occurrence of it in any literature is Adam and Eve. I'm not sure which one got the patent for it, but it's been core to how people interact with each other from the beginning of time.
Oh, yeah.
And so it is obviously very natural. It's a very useful skill and tool that we all innately use. When it comes to the world of cyber, I guess it's a matter of frustration for years watching one or another successful breaches and all this data being exfiltrated. And it always annoyed me, if you just think a moment, the entire cyber world is completely artificial. It's completely person-made. And it's under our control. And so when an attacker breaches a perimeter or breaches an encryption scheme, gets access to what you don't want them to get access to, why give them the real thing? When you have the opportunity with skillful designed technology to feed them unbounded amounts of crap.
Absolutely.
And that's like, well, of course you would want to do that. Give them fake diamonds, and there you go. So now how to operationalize them is the fun part and the hard part.
So you bring up a really good point, and this is one of those things that I struggled with for a little while. So when I first started getting involved in deception, I started digging into it and kind of put myself in the position. So, I occasionally do things like penetration tests and stuff like that. And I put myself in the position of an attacker and went, what would I do if I was presented with this? And the only conclusion that I could come up with is have a really, really hard time, right? I mean,
Right.
so I started looking at this and going, wow, this is amazing. It is so easy. It is so effective. It has so low of a false positive rating. It's so low risk. It's cost effective. So the question is, and the thing that I struggled with, first of all, was what am I missing? It can't be this good. And I realized that, no, I was wrong. It is this good. So the question that I would pose to you is, why do we see a lot of either active or perhaps passive resistance? Why doesn't everybody do this? What do you think is stopping organizations from just jumping into this boat with both feet?
So it's an excellent question, and I think there are many answers to it. There are a couple of core answers. First of all, deception has been used for a very long time in the cyberspace with honey nets and honeypots of various kinds. Those are used as tools of detection, a tripwire, if you were, so that you purposely put something out into the environment that's unused. It's not part of your operations. There's the key. It's not going to interfere. Easy to manage, you would hope. And if it is attacked, you're not doing any damage. The attacker's not doing any damage to the real systems, but is obviously alerting you that an attacker is aimed at you. So it's a very valuable tool, and honey nets and honey pots have been used from the beginning of time in defensive postures and security architectures. So beyond the detection part, obviously adversaries realize that these are common tools that are used by defenders and have tried various ways of evading them. and learning how to detect them themselves so that they can keep the honeypots busy and not provide any value. So the use of deception in that case is to detect and not just to keep the adversary busy, but to learn something about the modus operandi of the adversary, because you can watch what they do to the honeypot to learn more about them. And then, of course, as I said, then they evade their use. So honeypots on a network, honey nets on a network, fairly straightforward and not too difficult. But now when you start thinking about honey files, for example, or decoy documents, as I call them, or decoy apps, or decoy voicemails, or decoy telephone, SMS messages, and so forth, all of this is under our control. We can construct it, we can generate it. And it's key and important that a number of guiding principles be used when you are composing deceptive materials. They have to be believable. Otherwise, they're of no value. They have to be variable. There's nothing worse than having an invariant that eventually an adversary will learn and will know how to distinguish something that's real from something that's a decoy. And variability comes along with shelf life. Deceptive materials won't last forever. They have to be refreshed. Depending again on context. All of this to create enough believable material that the result of the use of deceptive materials has value to the defender. As I said, that value is detection. So you have to monitor those deceptive materials that learn when they have been exfiltrated, for example, monitor for them. But more importantly, what I'm really enthusiastic about is generating unbounded amounts of deceptive fake materials and stuffing it down the throat of the adversary. That has a second, and I think a more important value. That's to change the economics of the game. They're after data for obvious reasons. That data could have an awful lot of value. In and of itself, it may be an asset, but that data is also, for example, credentials that gain access to other assets that they can steal money, for example, or steal game time at a gaming site. And so when it comes to credentials that these phishers, scammers are after to steal identities, you can create fake credentials, decoy credentials that look entirely believable and stuff it down their throat. Why? Well, if you feed them a great number of bogus credentials, the moment they are described, bogus credentials that are not so bogus, have another utility. But if you feed them, they now have the conundrum. They have a database of stolen credentials. Some are real and some are fake. How are they going to know that?
Yep.
How are they going to then parse through all that data and identify the real from the fake? It's now cost. Right now, adversaries have zero cost. Most of what they do, especially in scale, has been automated. There's no real cost, and they steal time from other machines from the botnets that they've constructed. So they only have to pay ISP bills. So
absolutely.
This now changes the game. Well, they have now real work to do. And now comes the second part. Not only do they have real work, which changes the economics, making it now perhaps less profitable, now they have the real worry about possible attribution. Because given decoy credentials, for example, if you monitor for them and strategically use them and strategically monitor them, if the adversary is going to test the credentials to weed out the decoys, the testing itself, the testing process will reveal information about them and identify more information about them. And so they run the risk not only of increased cost in processing all this data, but the increased risk and chance that they will reveal more about themselves. So the use of deception in this context, deceptive materials, deceptive content, and specifically deceptive credentials, decoy credentials, is, I think, a huge change in the asymmetry of this cyber warfare.
Absolutely. I actually, one of the stories I gave in a previous episode had to do with a Cold War. The Soviets were trying to maintain technological equivalence with the West, and they were resorting to basically stealing technology. And so the U.S. became aware of that through communications with the French, which they got through a KGB agent or whatever. But the net effect is we got this big dossier of all these people that were involved in this technology, espionage, covert action, whatever. So we had the list of everybody involved. And what we could have done is just rounded them all up, deported them, or done whatever we needed to do. But there was an economist who was working at the time for the Reagan administration, which is when this happened. I don't remember his name off the top of my head, but he basically said, well, now we know what the Soviets want. Why don't we help them with their shopping? And so they found out that the Soviets were going to try to get some technology from like a microchip from a company in Canada. So they messed around with the microchip so that it would pass the Soviet quality checks, but it would fail in actual production. And the result of that was the largest non-nuclear explosion that has been witnessed from space in Siberia. And it also caused the Russians to now question every bit of stolen technology that they had. And so this concept of what you're talking about is we know what bad guys want when they get on our systems. So let's give them it. And if we give it to them under controlled circumstances, one, we can detect them. Because the second they interact with any of these, deceptive resources, ding, 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 an alert pops up. But because we now know the attackers on our network and they're kind of in a controlled environment that we understand, we don't have to kick them off the network right away. We can watch them. We can get threat intel. We can, attack attribution data, all of that stuff. And that is so phenomenally powerful.
Right. I did a project for DARPA, exactly this. That's active computer defense. When you do detect an adversary or you happen to trip over an APT that's been embedded for God knows how many months.
Yeah.
Exactly that. Herd them into a deceptive environment. The key, however, is the deceptive environment has to be highly believable. Mm-hmm. And so the hard problem is how do you create a deceptive computer system, network, endpoints, users on that network that's completely bogus, automatically generated, and so the APT is exfiltrating from that environment rather than the real environment. And that's an AI problem.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And it kind of goes to that concept of that deception suffers when multiple points of visibility happen. So if I create a very simple deception and let's just say I pop up a honeypot, right? It's just a computer. It's maybe instrumented to log it. If I just pop up a honeypot, but there's no traffic going from and to that honeypot, there are no network shares mapped to it, there's no sessions connected up to it, it's going to look ridiculous because it's not active. It's just completely fake. But if I was to go in and add that device into the ARP cache of production systems, or create fake network traffic that looks like somebody is communicating with it, or even create a fake Facebook user who's a fake employee who talks about the fake technology, all of these things reinforce the believability of that system. And the contrast to deception suffers from multiple, different channels of information. If you address those channels of information, then you end up with deception that is even more believable.
You got it.
But a lot of it, to me, it's one of those things of you've got to understand what your goals and objectives are. You don't do deception to do deception. You do deception to detect attackers, to get threat intel, to attribute, attribution data to prosecute or whatever, or what. You have to have a goal. And if your goal is purely detection, bad deception could work because all you're looking for is somebody to bump into an open port or use a fake credential. But if you want people to stay engaged, if you want the adversary to stay engaged, I think you're 100% correct that you need to create that believability factor. And I think to your point, one of the things that I think is the most challenging it's easy to put up systems. It's easy to have fake services. It's even easy to generate fake network traffic because I can simply grab the traffic and then run it through a variety of tools to just manipulate things about it. One of the challenges that I see all the time, though, is creating deceptive files. You want those files to appear real. You want them to look like they have actual good data, but you don't want it to have actual good data. And the big challenge is if I take actual production super duper top secret files and then simply do a find and replace for whatever, you could still end up with a lot of inferred information. And I know that you've done a lot of work on AI and a lot of work on this automation stuff. Have you done anything with respect to being able to generate fake data sets resulting to deception? And how would you suggest that people go about doing that?
Okay, and the answer is yes, and I'll hopefully startle you with a very simple answer on how you actually have amazing amounts of available data that's very easy to translate. If you go into your archives, so let's back up context, just hone in on a particular use case. If you have an APT, you could watch the embedded Trojans and embedded loggers and what they're gathering. And then that gathering operation is what you focus on to create a deceptive version of it. So here's the easiest case. Email logs. Email logs are juicy and great targets for embedded long-term persistent threats because think about you're embedded for long periods of time. You don't want to do a large-scale scan. You may get seen. Mm-hmm. So you want to focus on a source where you know you're going to get a new, fresh increment of data. After all, you've gotten everything yesterday, so you don't want to rescan and look at everything that you saw yesterday. You only want the new stuff to become much more efficient. Mm-hmm. So if you just look at an email logs, every day is a whole new set of email. Mm-hmm. And that gives you attachments in the emails. And these are active documents being exchanged by people. They're the most valuable sources of current information. Email logs. Bingo. Now you have a target, not only by the adversary, but you have a target of opportunity. If you go into email logs from 5 years ago, 4 years ago, people have changed. They're not in the organization. But the important thing about believability in email traffic is that it's a thread of conversation. So you have to make it look real. And how better than to use human-generated email, but from a bygone era that's not real. That's the old historical record. Wait a minute, there could be valuable information even in that, of course, but this is the next step. If you take that old email archive and then you essentially move it to today, mm-hmm. meaning you want to translate it in space and time to today. Mm-hmm. How to do that is an automatic process. It does require AI, and I'll tell you where it particularly needs AI. But to translate that email with all of the headers and all the timestamps to today's timestamp, that's pretty straightforward mapping. But to translate the content of the email is a bit more challenging because the way we refer to time in the email, I'm going to have dinner in about 2-3 hours. Let's have dinner next Thursday. Now, when you start referring to days of the week, you start referring to, how about April 2nd? We'll have a meeting and go and grab some lunch. Those content descriptions and discussions about time have to also be shifted. You can do that when you, that's a harder problem.
And that's one of those things that I think a lot of people would overlook, because as you were talking about it, I didn't think about that. But then as you were going, I'm like, oh yeah. Because if I was to say, if I was to take an email that supposedly was sent out today, and I say something like, I'll talk to you on Wednesday the 5th or whatever. Well, all it takes is somebody to go, wait a minute, those dates aren't right. Something's wrong there, to create that question mark in their head. So that's a really fascinating point, and I really like that.
Yeah, so to solve it is using natural language processing, defining the terms that you want to detect in the content, and then shift it appropriately. So you know what the date is, you know what Thursday the 21st is 5 years ago. What would the 21st be presently? That might be Friday. And so Thursday has to be changed to Friday and so forth. And that's an automatic process. It is achievable. There are complexities because in different contexts, time is referenced or referred to by people differently. For example, noon or 2 p.m. Or 1400 hours.
Right.
So if you're in a military context, you have to look for terms that are reference military time.
And I would think you also have issues with, I mean, even simple things like, all right, at the time the original email was sent out, it was sent out during daylight savings time, and the other time it's not. And if you have things like EDT as opposed to EST, you know, even things like that could potentially be that data point that a really observant person gets. So it's interesting though. And I think the most important piece of this conversation is not that it can be done. We know it can be done. I mean, if it's logical, there are ways to do it. But the most interesting thing to me about this is making sure that people are aware that it needs to be done. I think that a lot of people, and I'll be honest, today it's not that big of a deal, but I think a lot of people, they get scared of deception because of detail points like this. Oh my gosh, I've got to come up with the perfect deceptive story, the cover story, everything has to be perfect and all that kind of stuff. And I think the good news is today, right now, it's probably not that necessary, particularly if you're just interested in detection, because the adversaries aren't looking for deception yet. But as they start to, then we're going to have to ramp up our game. But the good news is we have time to do it because we're in this perpetual arms race with the bad guys. How important do you think it is, again, just kind of to come back to that, how important is it today to have that sort of perfect picture? And if it's not as important today, when do you foresee that being we have to go to that level of detail?
So it's important today for the nation state problem when you have cyber activities between the opposing ICs and militaries of all the various adversarial countries in the world, meaning all countries. So in that category, it's highly important and very difficult, and a lot of energy is put into making it work well enough in certain contexts. The key there is recognize there's still value even if you don't get it 100% right, because you're overwhelming your opponent with the cost of having to analyze and decide whether something is real or not. It's still a cost.
Oh yeah, I mean,
so
I was gonna say, oh, please go ahead.
You know, just say nation state, however, they have unbounded resources, and so you could use up some of those resources, but not enough. But it's still a useful strategic tool.
Well, I was gonna say, in other words, the worst case scenario when using deception is you slow down your adversary. Even if they figure it out, they now have to analyze. They have to baby step. They have to be very, very careful because one, they want to differentiate between the real and the fake so that they can get real data. And they also want to differentiate between the real and the fake because they don't want to get caught. So worst case scenario is you slow your adversary down. Best case scenario is you're collecting threat intel and attribution data, and you're completely redirecting and making all of their efforts entirely useless, which is an unbelievably powerful statement to make. So what do you think? So when we look at deception, and let's just say there's an organization out there and they're listening to this going, this deception stuff sounds awesome. What would be your advice to an organization that is new to this and they want to start implementing it? Like, how do you get there from here?
So, it's a very complicated answer, although the question sounds so simple. And if you look at use cases where there's real pain, that's where I would first concentrate. And pain is, depending upon the kind of company, I'm going to limit my answer to, and repeat what I was talking about earlier. Just think about yourself and everybody who's listening to this. How many relationships you have online. And relationships means you are a customer of organization or a member of an organization. You have access to a portal, you have access to a buying site, you have access to whatever that relationship entails. And typically it's going to have some value associated with your identity. Right? So let's use the simplest, the most obvious that everyone has, I hope, is a bank. And you have a banking relationship, you have a banking app on your phone, and you have a login to the online banking site that your bank provides. Agreed? Perfect.
I'm with you.
That's obvious. Now that's a context. And there's a context where we can actually design, and it's somewhat trivial to design a deceptive system with a huge potential benefit to the defenders who want not to have their customers. This is defenders inside the bank who do not want their customers' identities stolen, because if their identities are stolen, that means those identities gain access to the customer's assets, which is a fraud loss to them that they have to make good on. And of course, who the heck wants to deal with identity theft where somebody starts creating additional accounts in your name because they've stolen your credentials and your identity, your PII. It's a mess. I want to ask you a question before I proceed.
Yeah.
Because that context, what I really love about that context is just so crisp and clear. And it's ubiquitous. It's just the kind of stuff that really gets me very excited, because our credentials, which are nothing more than banging on a keyboard, gain access to our money.
Mm-hmm.
And it's that banging on the keyboard, the credential that we type, the password and the username, that's what the adversary's after. The context is crystal clear. The credential that I have, my username, I was allowed to suggest it or to define it.
Mm-hmm.
And then my password either was generated for me or I created one. Mm-hmm. It's under my control. And I lose it so easily, the average person who gets phished, for example. Mm-hmm. So that's a perfect context, because I can generate unbounded amounts of highly believable credentials that I can generate automatically. And if I send that to a phisher through a spam message at their spoofed website, they don't know what's real and what's not. Mm-hmm. Now here comes the magical part. Say I'm the defender in the bank. I now start thinking I'm going to use this deceptive strategy, but I'm going to take it one more step. I'm going to link this deceptive decoy credential I automatically generate with a real looking but deceptive decoy bank account. And so that when I stuff the website of the phisher, how do you do that? Well, if you get a phishing scam email, go to the site. Mm-hmm. And rather than entering in your real credential, enter in the decoy credential. Now the phisher has captured your deceptive credential. Next step, that deceptive credential, that decoy credential, is linked to a decoy account. Bingo. Now, what is the phisher going to do? They stole a credential. Mm-hmm. Is it real or is it fake? Well, now the fake ones look just like the real ones, because you can log into the bank and access an account. Bingo, it's a real credential as far as they're concerned. But no, it's not, because once you log in with the decoy credential and access the decoy account, and what you're going to do is transfer the money to another account. And it's that transfer process where now the bank learns the mules. The bank learns, how the heck do you think all of this phishing and scamming has an economic value to the phishers? They have to find a way to move the money, follow the money. They got to transfer the money. And it's those intermediary accounts, those are mule accounts, There's a Wikipedia page for it, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the ones you want to identify, because those are under the control of the phishers, and those, for them to get their money, they have to give up their identity to the financial institutions in order to grab their money. So
Oh, yeah.
bingo. So here we have now the opportunity to get not only attribution, but also recover their assets from their own bank accounts.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, and there's so much in there that I absolutely love. Like I want to I'm going to pick into that a little bit. So the one thing that you talked about is, all right, we're combating the phishing, and effectively the bad guys are using deception against us. And I think I've said this in every interview that I've done, but there's my favorite quote on deception was by, so you familiar with Barton Whaley?
That sounds familiar, but not.
So he's an author. He's passed away now, but he's an author who writes a lot of books on deception, primarily military deception. And so what he said, and he's got a book called Practice to Deceive. And what he said in that book, and I think I'm getting the quote pretty correct, is, in combat, deception strengthens the weaker side. When all other factors are equal, the more deceptive player or team will always win. Bad guys use deception against us. We haven't been traditionally using it. They keep winning. So I think that concept of highlighting that bad guys are using deception is a cool piece of that kind of concept. But the other piece of it that I think is super important is this aspect of, you said, if I receive a phishing email, I'm going to go click on the link and I'm going to go provide credentials. That's a human action. And I think that is one of the most important aspects of what you just said, because traditionally from a defensive security perspective, we have pit technology against human beings. The bad guys are the human beings, and we stack up technology to try to get in their way. Firewalls, IDS, IPS, whatever. And when you pit a human who is intelligent and adaptable and flexible against fairly static technology, the human wins most of the time. But with this, we're now getting a little bit of human involvement. We're having defenders actively engaging with the attackers in a small way, but we now have a human being on the other side. And I think one of the things that deception can do is it can reallocate or help us reallocate detective resources. We spend so much time tuning and tweaking our IDSs and our SIMs and those types of things. And if we could get really effective detection out of deception, which it does very, very well, very high fidelity, very low false positives, very low maintenance, all that kind of stuff, we can reallocate those resources to spending more time actively engaging with the attacker, whether that's dealing with phishing or changing the picture of deception in real time to combat the attacker. And I think that ultimately that ends up being kind of the superpower of deceptions in allowing us to detect attackers more easily so that we can adjust our allocated resources to being able to combat them head on. And I think that's huge. Thoughts on that?
Well, while you were saying that, I was thinking about Adam and Eve again. And how we have survived and become prolific on this planet. Deception has been a useful tool, and why it's not applied in cybersecurity as broadly as it can be and as it should be, it's just mind-boggling.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
so
I think that some of it. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. So just the word of caution. The one part of it that you really have to be careful is what I call non-interference. A number of properties associated with deception or deception-based systems. And non-interference, you must be careful not to entrap. Entrapment is only with respect to law enforcement, but not to trap your own people, not to trap yourself, or not to trap your organization in a lie because of the misuse or the improper or strategically faulty design of a deception system. And so this, by the way, circles back to the question you asked earlier on, which I never completed. Why it's not broadly used in large organizations is this very problem a concern that it's just too hard to manage to get it right, so that it's not used, if not used appropriately or smartly, it won't damage your own organization by proliferating falsehoods through your own organization. So non-interference with normal operations is a key property.
Oh yeah.
To keep in mind.
Oh yeah. And to those ends, you talk about creating that story, but not doing it in a way that's going to cause problems. I think that in some cases, the reason, going kind of expounding upon what you just said, I think that there's a lot of people, when we talk about deception and effectively you're creating a story that you're trying to tell the bad guys, right? And what I think is scary to some people about deception is most other security technologies are a step or two removed from the normal stuff that technologists do every day, but it's adjacent, right? So yeah, I can learn this technology, or I can go learn this technology, or I can go learn another technology. It's just technology. It's bits and bytes. It's not that big of a deal. But deception, if it's done right, involves some skill sets that we don't normally associate with technology and IT. There's a lot of creativity. There's a lot of, effectively, it's almost like being that movie writer, that screenwriter that tries to create a movie that allows for that suspension of disbelief that you want to get into. And that's such a different mindset than I work in binary. It's 1 or it's 0. So it's a really different skill set. And I think that the other piece that you run into, and I don't know how big of a factor this is, but let's face it, culturally, we believe that lying is wrong. It's mean. It's uncivilized to be dishonest. And the fact of the matter is that puts us at a huge disadvantage because the bad guys don't care.
Of course. So that's why I think it's a time that we not feel so guilty about fighting fire with fire.
Absolutely.
Adage.
So,
and I have no problem, and anybody can do this, by the way. Just a lesson for everyone. Next time they get a spam message, or if you wish, look in your spam folder and click on those links, and you'll go to a bogus Citicorp or Bank of America site. Go to the site. You're going to get a login page. You're going to get a Gmail login. Put in bogus material. Just have some fun. Let them pay a price. Lie to them. Why not?
Yeah. I mean, let's face it. Let's make their lives as miserable as possible. I mean, they're making our lives miserable. They don't care. I mean, we should be doing the same. I mean, obviously, we're not going to go outside the boundaries of what's legal and all that kind of stuff. But there's a lot of things that we can do that are absolutely legal, that are absolutely moral and ethical and all that just make the attackers' lives miserable. And the more we can do, I mean, let's face it, right now, attackers live in a target-rich environment. There is no shortage of environments to go compromise. And if nothing else, if you start playing with deception and you make your environment more difficult for the attacker to mess with than your next door neighbor, they go and attack your next door neighbor. And so I think just jumping in and doing it, not being scared of it. You talked about the tech, if you think about it, deceptive concepts. I mean, Sun Tzu was writing about deception 2,500 years ago. You talked about like honey nets. Couple episodes ago, I interviewed Lance Spitzner, who is the founder of the Honey Net Project. That's technology that is in large part 3 decades old. So decades old technology, millennia old concepts, and we're just packaging it in a different way. So I guess I'll throw kind of like a final thought, because we've been going for a little while now. What would you say to people? What would be your final thoughts? What do you want to leave people with respect to an understanding of deception? Or if it's, you want to point them at a resource or tell them to go look at something, the floor is yours for wrap things up from a deception perspective.
So I'll make 2 points. First of all, the things I talked about with respect to phishing campaigns and this use of deception is a core product of Allure Security, my company. That's all emanated from my lab at Columbia that was sponsored by DARPA for various kinds of use cases. But this one I particularly enjoy because it affects so many people, especially now. And I'm really quite angry that the COVID-19 has created so many bad scams that have impacted so many people. And people are scared naturally. They're buying bogus material online. They're giving up their personally identifying information. So after the pandemic calms and we'll be in some steady state of some new normalcy, as people call it, when we look back, we're going to realize how not only the economic impact of what the government spent to pump into the economy, but so many people are going to have identity theft problems up the wazoo.
Oh yeah.
So there's going to be another wave of economic impact because of all the damage that's been done now. So it's very important that this be really solved and I believe deception can be a key to solving it, as I said, by changing the economics. With respect to fear, as you were saying, that people feel it's not right to lie and so forth, we lie all the time. But here's the best way I can think of it. If you yourself are walking down the street in Raleigh, North Carolina, for example, a random person comes up to you and says, "What's your name?" How do you respond? Now, in Raleigh, North Carolina, you may actually say something reasonable.
Yeah.
In New York City, you go like, "What's it to you?"
Yeah, I'm walking down 6th Avenue and somebody walks up, I'll be like, no thanks.
Yeah. So you're going to defend yourself when you feel threatened, and especially by somebody you don't know. It's the scammers who present themselves as the relationship you have, as the Bank of America or Wells Fargo, the brands that you know, and you are so comfortable answering. You'll give your full name. Hey, my name's Sal Stolfo. That kind of trickery just enrages me, that people fall for it so easily. And why I'm mentioning this is that the folks whose brands are being attacked this way, whose websites are being copied by the scammers, they really got to step up to the plate to do more to protect their customers. And deception is a very powerful way to do that. Create a whole bunch of bogus customers. And when a customer reports or an email filter reports a bogus site, go and stuff it with bogus identity information. They can do this. They can change the balance of power.
They absolutely can.
And they can automate it to essentially a no-cost operation.
Yep.
So lying is good in scale.
and I will say this, you talk about lying, and I mean, you said we do it all the time, and we do it all the time. And I kind of want to point out, like, think of the white lie, right? Does this dress make me look fat? Or think of the lies that we tell when we are trying to arrange a surprise party for somebody. We have no qualms about those white lies that make society work properly. Because, I mean, let's face it, if everybody was brutally honest with everybody else about everything, society would degrade virtually overnight. We lie all the time. We just believe that we're doing it for the right reasons. These are the right reasons.
The right reasons.
Absolutely. Awesome. So, Sal, this has been awesome. I completely appreciate, the opportunity to kind of go through this stuff with you. I will go ahead and make sure that, when I do the show notes for this, I'll make sure that I put links to Allure and all that kind of fun stuff, so that if people want to go check it out, they absolutely can do that. I've been stacking up these interviews, so it'll probably be a couple of weeks, and I'll let you know when it goes up. For those of you who are watching this, if you enjoyed this content, please click on that little subscribe button, the little bell next to it to get those notifications. If you liked it, click the like button, share it. You guys know what to do. So definitely awesome. And, again, if we think about this in a different way, if we can apply deceptive concepts to our defensive security, it really and truly can help us take back the advantage.